Welcome again to Out of This World. I'm Matthew Nicolantonio with Scott Sutherland, meteorologist, science writer, and today TV critic. Part two, I guess, of our series. We previously have talked about the science fiction in some very popular films. Today we're going to talk about the science fiction in some TV shows.
That's right.
So we've got a good list here of stuff, and we'll again say we're going to be talking only about the science itself. This is not a TV critique show.
We're not going to critique whether the shows are bad or good.
Right.
Just what kind of science is in it, if it has any science for that matter, and any of the effects of the science in them. Yeah.
Okay, so speaking of not a lot of science in it, we're going to mostly go chronologically, but we'll start with Star Trek all the way back to the 1960s.
Yeah.
Initially, not a lot of hard science, but as time has gone on, science has in a way mimicked what happened on Star Trek. So explain a little bit.
A lot of scientists watched Star Trek.
And basically said, I want to do that.
Yeah. So, I mean, when they first made the show, everything was like a storytelling vehicle. Like just the transporters were just a way of getting them from the ship to wherever they were going, another ship or the planet, immediately. They didn't have to take the shuttle, and it was just easier that way. Warp drive was just a way of getting around in space faster, but they didn't detail how it happens. That came later on, where scientists kind of picked up and said, how would you do that? How would you make a warp drive? How would you physically teleport people from one place to another? And even things like the medical scanners and so forth. Like how would you do that? How would you make a tiny little scanner that could scan someone's entire physiology and tell what's wrong with them and so forth? So, there was a lot of inspiration from it, a lot of inspiration directly for the show, I should say, where they took those concepts and went, okay, well, how would you make a warp drive? How would that work? And that has real physical ideas behind it. I mean, you cannot exceed the speed of light if you travel through space. That is a physical limit. Einstein showed it with his equations, and his equations have never been proven wrong so far. So so if we are traveling through space, we cannot exceed the speed of light. But there's nothing that says that space itself cannot exceed the speed of light. So the idea behind warp drive now that we know of would be wrapping your ship in a bubble of space where you are, and then exerting some kind of force on the universe itself, the space-time itself, to make the space-time between you and your destination shrink, and the space-time between you and your current location expand, and that would move your position in space to a different point in space. So you're moving space itself, not through it, so you can bypass that rule completely. And how we would do that, I don't think anybody truly knows. I mean, from what I've read, it could take something called negative energy, which I mean, just there is no real thing as such as negative energy right now. So, and it requires exotic matter, which is just a way of saying we don't know what it would take. We don't know what could produce this effect. So that transporters, we have an idea. Michio Kaku talked about this in his science communication, where you would scan a person and destroy them, and then send their information to the destination where they would be rebuilt. But that's a duplicate. That is not you anymore. That is a duplicate of you, where the universe wouldn't care. It would have all your memories and exactly like you. Anybody that you knew or loved would be exactly the same person. It's just that you, the original person, would be gone. Very, very different connotations behind that, especially morally speaking. But we do have an idea of how you could do that. Maybe with inanimate objects would be best for in reality. But all the science that was inspired by Star Trek is immense, from, like I said, medical scanners to space travel to, just the technology itself. Like we have cell phones because they're like Star Trek communicators. They were thinking, how would we make this kind of technology where we could just walk around with a full computer library and communication device in our hand. and things of that nature. So it maybe it didn't start off hard sci-fi with a lot of hard science, but it developed a lot of hard science over the years.
Yeah, and similar to what we talked about in our film episode, a little bit more.
Yeah,
and this was more with Star Wars. Science fantasy than science fiction, but it, over time did kind of become a little bit more
very unique in that way.
Yeah, for sure. Fascinating stuff. All right, we jump ahead a few years. We're going to talk now about Space 1999.
Yeah,
so this was from 75 to 77. So they were looking ahead about 25 years in the future, talking about, you know, a moon base in 1999, which could have been conceivable
if they had stuck with the Apollo program beyond 18. I think that maybe we would have developed that. You know, felt a little disappointed when we reached 1999 and we didn't have a moon base already. But yeah, I mean, but the technology that they showed in the show was very much sort of developed from the sort of the aesthetic of the Apollo program. And so very, very cool in that way. Like, it's a very retro thing now when we look back on it. But there's a few things that were, I mean, there was a lot that was not science in that. I mean, having nuclear explosions go off on the moon to actually push the moon out of Earth's orbit, that's not, no way. And have them survive?
Right.
No way at all. That would be impossible. But it's an entertaining show.
Right.
But yeah, the sort of overall concepts of it, of the moon being pushed out of Earth's orbit and traveling so far that they meet aliens and so forth, there's no way of that happening. But otherwise, it seemed fairly grounded in basic science, like how these ships would move and the equipment that they would use, the spacesuits and the communicators, and even this, like, the aesthetic of the environments that they lived in on the moon were very much grounded in sort of just that. What would we think that we would develop over 25 years from Apollo through to this moon base? So yeah, very neat.
All right, let's talk now about Battlestar Galactica. A couple of different versions. So where does the science lie in Battlestar Galactica?
There's not a lot there. Right. I mean, one of the things that's done a lot in science fiction is that you have ships that are built that they seem to be more like the ocean-going vessels that we have today, or the ones that we fly through the air, where people stand on the floor of the vehicle and they are facing towards where they are flying to or moving to. That brings into the idea that you would need, like, gravity generators on the floor to keep your feet rooted there. You would need the Star Trek idea of the inertial dampener to prevent, when you propel the ship forward, you don't fly back, to hit the wall and get injured and so forth. Because that's not really how you would build a spacecraft. You would build a spacecraft in a more of a way where, without these sort of fantastical technological marvels of anti-gravity and inertial dampening and so forth, you would build it in a much different way to have people fly around in the universe. The reboots ideas about how AI might develop and so forth are very interesting. I mean, they may even be coming out with a new version of the show, because we've had a lot of ideas about AI these days. So, not a lot of sci-fi in it. Very entertaining.
Right.
Both versions, in fact. I enjoyed both of them in their time, but yeah, not a lot of great science in them.
All right, let's talk about the show V. Which does have some interesting ideas. Talking about aliens and how they would change their appearance to, appear to be less harmful or less dramatic to us. So let's talk a little bit about that.
So V is that these aliens arrive. They are peaceful to us. They want to exchange technology and so forth. But there's a nefarious side to it where they eventually found out that they are lizard people underneath these masks. Spoiler alert. And that they want to steal our water and they want to take people as food. And the idea behind masking yourself as us, as being like us, is pretty good, actually. They probably didn't think about it a lot at that time, but we are very, like, maybe xenophobic, at least to things that are truly alien. Even like bugs and spiders and animals that are very much not like us, we can get a little bit reserved.
Right.
We can be downright fearful of these things. So if true aliens were to arrive, that might really have a bad impact on our way of thinking about them.
Right.
So masking themselves as us, or using humans as sort of go-betweens between them and us, might be a benefit for both of our species, especially if they are truly peaceful. They might do it anyway, right? They might say, no, we don't want to freak them out. We know that is something that happens to a lot of alien species, that it's difficult to accept other intelligent beings that look so much different from them. So masking as us might help that. Now, in the base sort of idea behind the show of coming down here to steal our water resources and us as resources as well, they probably wouldn't need to do that. If they are truly hopping from habitable world to habitable world, doing this repeatedly, they're wasting a lot of energy coming down into our sun's gravity well as far as where Earth is. They could stay on the outskirts of our star system in the Oort cloud, which is this giant sort of spherical shell, very loosely, not packed, but very like all these very large icy cometary bodies, that they could just mine water from there directly. And we've seen from comets that pass through, that there's plenty of organic molecules on these objects as well, that they could harvest those materials and use those to produce their own food. Probably the farthest they would need to come in to our system is maybe Saturn, because Saturn's rings are all ice water chunks. And Titan is a perfect environment to get organic molecules from. So that idea, and it's been back through the decades of science fiction of aliens coming here to take our resources, where they wouldn't nearly need to do that. They have enough, there's enough much farther out that they wouldn't need to waste the energy to come here.
Speaking of moving from one area of space to another, from planet to planet using wormholes, the idea behind Stargate SG-1, which ran from 97 to 2007. Realistic?
Well, in that respect, I mean, building these gates that could harness wormholes, we have no idea how that would work. I mean, maybe someday, maybe when we become technologically advanced enough, maybe we will figure that out. But for now, that part is total fantasy. There's a lot of good science that goes into the show, though. They had a lot of great science advisors for every iteration of the show as well, because there are at least 2 more beyond SG-1 that had awesome science advisors working with them, because some of the characters are astrophysicists and scientists themselves, and they were able to provide them with credible science to portray on the show and make it all believable and everything. And it was really cool in that respect. So the base concept behind the show, not so scientifically accurate, but pretty much everything else, there's so much more that was really scientifically accurate in that show. Moving on to The Expanse, which you have described to me in our pre-production as perhaps the most accurate far future sci-fi series on TV. That's right.
What makes it so?
Pretty like it happens about 300 years into the future. So this is on the same sort of timeline equivalency to Star Trek: The Next Generation. Whereas Star Trek TNG has warp drives and teleporters and phasers and all these other fantastical things, The Expanse is rooted in reality. I mean, it is spacecraft that we could probably build within the next decade or 2. I mean, just the concepts behind them, where a spacecraft is built like arranged kind of like a building, with the engine at the bottom of the building in the basement. And then, so you're standing on decks that are arrayed with your head pointing towards the nose of the ship. So that when you are traveling and accelerating towards a destination, you will be pressed down into the floor, and that will produce a gravity-like effect to give you at least, maybe not up to 1G like we have here on Earth, but some good fraction of Earth's gravity to just make it more comfortable to be traveling around. And then when they are going to get to a destination, they don't just hit the brakes. they flip the ship around and point their engine towards their destination about halfway through, and then they thrust again, and that slows them down, and also again provides you with gravity-like effect, because you're still have the momentum of going your original speed. You're going to be again pressed into the ground, so you feel like there's a gravity effect. The only time you don't have gravity is when you're just traveling at a constant speed, and then they have magnetic boots for that. So all the technology is really well done. The way they travel through space, no straight lines, because if you're going to travel from one place to another in the solar system, everything is curves, everything is arcs and ellipses and so forth. There's no straight lines. Now, the technology that does get them around the solar system, the Epstein engine, is that they call it, the Epstein drive, that is the fiction part, where we don't have anything that can propel a ship from Earth to Mars in days. It takes months. So that's the only part where they said, that's obviously the fiction that sort of gets us to the point where we can tell a really good story in a short amount of time in our solar system. So, but there's no interstellar travel. We were confined to our solar system, at least for the first several books and for the first several seasons, because we don't have a way of we don't have warp drive or hyperspace or anything like that. Any weaponry and so forth is all very rooted in what we have now with projectile weapons, missiles, and so forth. No lasers and so forth. They didn't bother doing anything with that. But things like AI, the author or one of the authors, Ty Frank, has said that they do have AI, and though it's not portrayed as robots and fully like Data from Star Trek or and so forth, they do have AI in the way that their computers work. Are very that's artificial intelligence in that way. It's a way of a responsible use of not producing these computer programs that can, think and for themselves, and then treat them as, servants and so forth. They get past all of that by just having them be very more realistic ways of depicting AI that we would use even today. But yeah, I mean, and we go again to things like being able to survive in space, where instantly opening up your visor on your helmet doesn't instantly kill you. Right. I mean, if they depicted it in a way where if you are ejected out into space, you're not going to live for very long. You have maybe 15 seconds before you pass out, and then you just be gone. You'll be dead. So, but one character actually does, he's sort of hovering there in space, and he's got this, something is dangling down in front of his visor where he can't see properly. So he pops his visor open, breathes out to get the air out of his lungs, because of the pressure difference would hurt him if he tried to hold his breath. He grabs whatever it is and rips it out of his helmet, reseals it, and then he breathes again. Right. And that's perfectly valid.
And that's a popular sort of misconception. Is that the second that the helmet opens,
you're frozen solid,
you're vaporized.
And even at one point, one of the main characters leaps from one ship to another without a spacesuit on.
Right.
And they timed it perfectly, and they said, okay, she's a very smart person. She brought a little hypo spray of oxygenated blood. She breathed out to get the air out of her lungs so she wouldn't damage her lungs. And she leapt across. When she started to pass out, hit herself with that hypo that gave her
kind of like an EpiPen.
Yeah, exactly. But oxygenated her blood to keep her conscious, and she survived. She had radiation burns on one side of her body from the solar radiation. She had broken capillaries in her eyes and her skin from the exposure to extreme low pressure. But that's something that is survivable for a very short amount of time, and they've depicted it so well. And yeah, it's overall, I mean, and there are fantastical aspects that get introduced later on in the series from an alien technology that's introduced, but otherwise, so well done about the depictions of the environments of Earth in the far future, with the way we're treating the environment these days, about how Mars is being terraformed, living on inside objects like Ceres and Vesta, living on the moons of Jupiter, and so forth. It's extremely well done.
All right. And let's finish up. The last show we'll talk about is For All Mankind.
Yeah.
Recreates the Apollo missions from the 60s. and 70s, you've noted becomes a little bit speculative at times. But how do you evaluate the science within the show?
It's really, really well done. I mean, for the first few seasons, it just sort of emulates what they were doing in the Apollo program. So it takes place in the late 60s, early 70s. And if they recreate it, but again, it's one of those alternate timeline ideas, like we talked about before. And so it's this idea that, what if the Russians had made it there to the moon first? What if they just beat the Apollo mission, Apollo 11, to the moon? And how that would spur the United States to continue the program over a longer period of time. And the technology is very rooted in those Apollo, the way the ships were built and the way they moved on the moon when they established a base there, how they would do that initially, looking for water in the craters at the South Pole of the moon. They did that in the show as well. But then, they start getting into the speculative, okay, if we did that though, then what would the 80s have looked like? What would the 90s have looked like, the 2000s and so forth? And how we wouldn't have been sending, they would have sent the Opportunity and Spirit rovers and so forth. But then, so that, like, the Pathfinder mission wasn't this robotic mission. It was a human mission to Mars that launched from the moon to Mars using a space shuttle-like ship powered by nuclear engines, which is something that we've thought about in the actual science, real world, in the past. And it takes a very realistic approach to where you would build things on the moon, on Mars, how you would get there, the concerns that you would have to have when you live in these environments. There were a few parts where, like, their spacesuits were a little bit too clean on the moon and Mars, because the dust, lunar dust and Martian dust, is very statically charged. So you would need a way to very easily get that off of you. Otherwise, your spacesuit would be extremely gray on the moon and extremely orange on Mars. You would not be walking around for very long in a very bright white, spacesuit for very long. So,
and the way they walked was you see them walking around in their moon base in a normal way, but there's like 1/10 of Earth's gravity on the moon, I think it is, and you would be more like skipping, like hopping along would be a better way of moving along, because it actually would be. It's actually more difficult for us to try to move normally, like to walk in a normal fashion on the moon. You tend to fall over more often. Yeah. So being able to just hop from place to place, like skip down a hallway and to get places. Even on Mars, it's the same thing, where they didn't portray that so well, but would be difficult to do in a limited budget science fiction show, being able to portray it in that way. They did a really good job. There were a few ways that they just sort of went, well, just to make it easier on us, we'll just sort of skip past that. Yeah. People aren't going to really, that's not the focus of the show. So well, that does kind of take me to a question that I wanted to ask more broadly about the genre. And maybe this is difficult to answer. What's sort of the viewer expectation of a sci-fi show? Like, I'm sure there's a balance, but do most people want that to lean more to scientifically accurate, or are they okay with, like, let's take a lot of liberties so we can just tell a good story?
Well, in a lot of cases, it seems like there's a combination of both. When you get into things that are really, really far-fetched, maybe, I guess would be, is that people start to say, well, this is more of a fantasy thing. Right. But I mean, I would say that the best way of doing it is that if the science is going to interfere with the story, then put the science aside, because the story part is the more important part. Like even The Expanse, all of this science that goes into the show is all in the background. It doesn't become the focus of the show. The focus of the show is basically how humans struggle to be recognized as being valid, and the interplay between opposing governments and trying to bring peace to the solar system, and it's more of that thing, the struggle of getting human society to a place where everybody can live in peace. I mean, that's the basic idea behind the show, and everybody having their different opinions on how that could be accomplished. But the science is all in the background, so it's very accurately done. But you don't tend to notice it until you really think and go, wait, they really did that really well.
Right.
That was very, very accurately
So that's kind
portrayed.
of the best when it's seamlessly, that you don't have to think too much about it.
Right.
That seems to generate the best results.
I think so. Yeah.
All right. Lots to think about as you explore science fiction, either looking back or looking forward.
Yeah.
Kind of like how science fiction does, looking back, looking forward. So
exactly.
Next time you watch, or when you're watching something new, just maybe keep some of these notes in the back of your mind. I certainly will. Scott, thank you so much for your expertise today.
Yeah, this has been fun.
This has been another episode of Out of This World.
It's very pretty out here.